Arlington National Cemetery isn't exactly obscure. It's the country's most well-known cemetery, probably. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some odd and interesting stories about how this giant piece of land with a preeminent view overlooking the Capitol came to be the most well-known cemetery in the country. Arlington is, of course, hallowed ground. I have friends there, good friends, who died while wearing the uniform. It is a beautiful homage to their lives, their service, and their sacrifice. But even after it transitioned to a burial ground, it spent several decades on the cusp of going back into private hands. Specifically, those of the family of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, who was the owner of the estate before the outbreak of the Civil War. Preventing that was done in a unique, aggressive, and potentially spiteful way. 6 weeks after the Battle of Fort Sumter, the beginning of the Civil War, Union soldiers were ordered to commandeer the Custis estate across the Potomac from Washington, D.C., which rose up to a hill that overlooked the city. This point would be a perfect location for artillery to hit the Capitol, should it be controlled by the Confederates. On top of that hill stood Arlington House, owned by General Robert E. Lee and his wife Mary. The estate was referred to as the Custis Estate, as it had been in Mary's family, whose great-grandmother was Martha Washington, formerly Martha Custis, having been previously married and widowed before old George came around. General Lee had left in order to join the Army of the South, and Mary left only when word reached her that the Union had set in motion its plan to commandeer the site, and she hastily departed for Lexington, Virginia 5 days prior. She wrote some hotly worded letters to General Sheridan in charge of the forces that overtook the grounds, but the biggest hit came in 1863 when the federal government levied taxes on any of the insurrectionary districts it retook control of. Mary Lee, owner of the estate, as it had been passed down through her family, was assessed a tax burden of $92.70 on the estate, valued at $34,000. Now behind enemy lines, she sent a trusted man to pay the sum, equal to about $2,200 today. $90, no big deal, I'm sure she thought. After this war of northern aggression is over, at least she will get her property back, she must have assumed. But Mrs. Lee was wrong. The federal government pulled a little sneaky on those insurrectionist landowners. They abided by the letter of the tax law, which stated that all taxes must be paid by the property owner, as in person. Literally, money from the owner's hands to the collectors. That's tough for someone who has fled their home and crossed into rebel territory. Intentionally tough, some might say. So this property was forfeited, and under direction of none other than Mr. Abraham Lincoln, in January of 1864, it was sold at auction to the highest bidder, which in a move that stunned absolutely no one, was the federal government, which bought the property for $26,800. I guess they just make the check out to themselves? I'm not sure how that works. Either way, using a presidential executive order was a shrewd way to hopefully prevent the Lees from attempting to use the legal system to get their property back at the end of the war. This would undoubtedly come into question by the Lee family, which would be further complicated by the fact that certain individuals were doing their best to prevent them from even wanting it back. But now, the 1,100 acres surrounding Arlington House was officially a Union encampment, defending the Capitol from invasion from the South. Men, horses, and wagons trod all over, turning the grass areas into mud. The woodlots and trees were cut down for firewood and for their camp constructions, to include a massive stable for horses and mules. Only the largest trees were saved, marked by officers to prevent their harvesting, providing much-needed shade during the humid summers. A series of forts were built around the main house after the First Battle of Manassas in July 1861 occurred relatively close to the Capitol, with lines cleared so roads and telegraph wires could connect them, and to provide multiple egress points for the headquarters located at the mansion. For several years, it remained a relatively stable camp. The biggest threat was at the hands of the 14,000 Union soldiers themselves, many of them from rural areas and with a propensity to assume that it was their right to cut down any tree that they may need. Stumps, piles of brush, and broken fences led to a devastation of the land's former glory. And there was always a contingency plan to burn the mansion should the Confederates make a move on Washington, although this never came to be. As battles waged on across the North and South, the bodies of men who had fallen in battle began to overflow the small local cemeteries. And the Quartermaster General of the United States, one Montgomery Meigs, was put in charge of finding grounds for national cemeteries for those who had died in service to the country. Meigs could think of no place better to bury the brave Union soldiers than on the grounds that once belonged to his former friend and mentor, Robert E. Lee. Meigs, who was also a close advisor to President Lincoln, felt betrayed and angered at Lee's treason and was said to have taken a grim satisfaction in being able to honor the fallen of the North on an estate overlooking the capital that was previously held by the rebel general. In May of 1864, the first graves were positioned at the northernmost part of the property, directed by General derelict, who occupied the mansion as a headquarters and residence, and wanted it done as far from the mansion as possible. During his initial inspection, Meigs found this to be insufficient, making it clear that the burials should be done closer to the mansion. derelict, in a slim effort to appease the Quartermaster General, began a new section to the west of the house, as he and the officers garrisoned at the camp headquarters were less than keen about having bodies interred outside their living spaces. Again, Meigs was unsatisfied. He personally directed the location of the graves of the first officers buried on the site, only 4 days after the first soldiers themselves were laid to rest. Captain Albert Packard was the first, and when Meigs said he wanted the graves to be close to the mansion, well, Meigs meant it. In what remained of Mrs. Mary Lee's flower garden, Captain Packard was the first of 45 officers interred just outside the windows of the house. Though this disturbed the officers living in Arlington House, it proved Meigs's point. To prevent the Lees from returning, he would make it not only uncomfortable but nearly impossible to change without being objectionable. And by change, I mean literally digging them up and moving them. Within a month, 2,600 men had been laid to rest, 5,000 in the first year. As many as 60 burials a day were happening. Less than a year later, the war would be over. Bodies of men buried at battlefields around the country made their way to Arlington. The living, those rebels who had fled from their homes, came back as well. Robert E. Lee and Mary Lee did not attempt to return, staying in Lexington. But in December of 1865, Lee's older brother, Sidney Smith Lee, toured the grounds. He remarked that the house could still be used as a home if the graves were removed from the garden and the cemetery area sectioned off. Well, upon hearing about this, Montgomery Meigs knew he had been right all along, and also knew his work wasn't over. He was now going to double down on making any return of the Lee family as intolerable as possible. Adjacent to the flower garden, under direction of Meigs, a circular pit was dug, 20 feet deep and 20 feet in diameter. A cement structure was poured with multiple chambers built into it. Chambers that were filled with bones. One chamber for arms, one for legs, one just for skulls. The remains of over 2,000 men who all died in battle but were unidentifiable. Sealed in 1866 and capped with a massive sarcophagus, it became the tomb of the unknown Civil War soldier, which was much more common than most people probably think. Half of all those killed in battle during the war would be buried unidentified. By the following year, over 14,000 soldiers were laid to rest at Arlington. The house itself was nearly empty, being used for storage and barracks for workers of the cemetery. Amongst the graves, monuments were installed to honor the Union dead. Many called for the house to be torn down, removing the last vestige of antebellum South from the capital area, and cutting into the memory of those soldiers who fought against it. This would obviously not come to be.
In 1870, General Lee died, and in 1873, Mary Lee followed. The estate, had it stayed in the hands of the family, would have gone to their eldest son, George Washington Custis Lee, known as Custis. Upon her death, Custis filed his lawsuit against the federal government to return the property. After almost a decade, it would eventually get to the Supreme Court, who deemed the acquisition illegal, having ignored due process or compensation, and Custis was granted ownership of the house and the 1,100-acre estate in 1882. Lincoln and Meigs's fears had been realized. The Lee family had taken back Arlington. But as it turns out, Custis, the former Confederate Major General himself, didn't really want to live in the center of the largest memorial to Union soldiers conceivable, especially with a bedroom that overlooked his mother's garden, now lined with the remains of Northern officers. He immediately sold the property back to the federal government for $150,000. Meigs had done it. His foresight, cunning, and planning had protected this, the nation's most hallowed ground. With the help of several dozen officers and thousands of soldiers, the final hilltop defense of Arlington was officially complete. They could now truly be at rest. As Civil War veterans aged and died, some elected to be buried amongst their comrades here. It wasn't until General Sheridan requested to be buried at Arlington that it became a premier destination for the recently deceased veterans. As time passed, the manor was brought back to its former features and used to tell the history of the property. With each passing year, more and more veterans, prominent politicians, and figures found their final resting place here overlooking the Capitol. 400,000 in total so far, all thanks to those 45 officers and 2,111 unknown soldiers defending the top of the hill.
You can check out these videos if you have an interest in other cemeteries that have a strange origin story. Thanks for watching, and until next time, get lost.